The ship dropped out of hyperspace, and the planet filled the viewport like a bruise against the stars. A swollen world of red desert and black stone, ringed by 3 pale moons that hung in the void like the eyes of something ancient and waiting. Sarah Marin pressed her forehead against the cold glass and watched the world grow larger, and she thought about how small Earth looked from this far away. How easy it was to forget that 8 billion people were counting on what she did next. She was 32 years old, and she was not a warrior. The Galactic Concord had made that very clear when they selected her as humanity's champion for the Trial of Worth, the ancient ceremony that decided whether a new species earned the right to sit among the stars as equals, or was sent back to its little corner of the galaxy for another 200 years of silence. They had not chosen her because she was the strongest, or the fastest, or the most dangerous thing humanity had to offer. They had chosen her because of a test, a long and strange evaluation that measured something the Concord called species representation, which meant that out of every human alive, she was apparently the one who most perfectly reflected what humanity was at its core. She was a former combat medic who had served during the brutal first contact skirmish with the Dreth hegemony 3 years ago, a woman who had held dying soldiers in her arms on both sides of the fight, and who had come home with steady hands and a heart full of cracks that she kept hidden behind a calm face and a voice that never shook even when it should have. The shuttle landed on Keth Vorin with a sound like thunder swallowed by sand, and Sarah stepped out into air that tasted like copper and electricity, and she looked up at the arena. It was enormous, beyond anything she had imagined. The structure rose from the desert floor like a mountain that someone had hollowed out and filled with light, a colosseum built for gods, with walls that stretched so high they vanished into the haze of the upper atmosphere, and seating that could hold millions of beings from thousands of worlds. Screens floated in the air above the arena, like massive glowing jellyfish, and each one showed a different angle of the grounds below. Sarah realized with a cold feeling in her stomach that every single one of those screens was broadcasting to every inhabited world in the galaxy. Trillions were watching. A figure approached her across the landing platform, and Sarah had to force herself not to step back, because the creature was terrifying in the quiet way that things are terrifying when they are completely without emotion. Arbiter Gelthari was an insectoid being that stood 7 feet tall on 4 segmented legs, with a torso like polished obsidian and a face that was all angles and compound eyes that reflected Sarah's own face back at her in 100 tiny fragments. "Are the human," Gelthari said, and it was not a question. "I am," Sarah said. "You are smaller than expected. I get that a lot." Gelthari studied her for a long moment with those fractured eyes, and then turned without another word and walked toward the arena, and Sarah followed because there was nothing else to do. Inside the arena's preparation chambers, she met the other champions, and each one of them made her feel like a candle standing in a room full of bonfires. There was a Gorath champion who stood 9 feet tall and was covered in plates of natural bone armor that looked thick enough to stop a bullet, and whose 4 arms each ended in claws that could tear through steel. There was a Yanari champion whose body was wrapped in a field of visible psychic energy that made the air around her shimmer and hum, and whose eyes glowed with a light that seemed to look through Sarah rather than at her. There was a Drexian champion who was more machine than flesh, with limbs that had been replaced by weapons and sensors, and who moved with the precise mechanical grace of something designed for a single purpose. Sarah looked at all of them, and then she looked down at her own hands, the hands of a medic, scarred and steady, and empty of any weapon, and she thought about the 8 billion people watching from a pale blue dot impossibly far away. The first trial came the next morning. They called it the Gauntlet of Survival, and it was exactly what it sounded like, a brutal obstacle course through a landscape that shifted and changed and tried to kill them in creative ways every few seconds. The Gorath champion smashed through walls of stone with his fists, and the Yenari champion floated above fields of razor wire on waves of psychic force, and the Drexian champion calculated optimal paths through kill zones with machine precision. Sarah ran, and she dodged, and she crawled through mud, and she used every trick she had learned in combat medicine to keep her body moving when it wanted to stop. And when she came to a section where the ground was covered in a substance that burned like acid, she remembered a technique from field training, and wrapped her boots in strips torn from her jacket, and kept going. She finished last among the survivors, but she finished, and that was enough. The second trial was called the Mind of War, and it was a tactical simulation where each champion had to outmaneuver an AI opponent in a complex battlefield scenario. The other champions used brute force and psychic manipulation and computational power. Sarah used something different. She noticed that the simulation included civilian populations in the battlefield, and while every other champion ignored them or treated them as obstacles, Sarah built her entire strategy around protecting them and evacuating them, and using the enemy's willingness to cause collateral damage against it. Fastest victory, but the judges noted that she was the only champion in 11,000 years of provings who achieved 0 civilian casualties in the simulation. The galaxy murmured. On the night before the third and final trial, Sarah sat alone in her cell, and she looked up through the skylight at the field of unfamiliar stars. And somewhere out there, hidden by distance and dust, was a small yellow sun and a small blue world, and everyone she had ever loved. The Arbiter had told her nothing about what the final trial would be, except that it would test something called Dominion, and that it would be revealed at dawn. Sarah pressed her hand against the cold wall, and she whispered to the stars, and to the pale dot she could not see, but knew was there. "Don't let them down." And the stars said nothing back, but the silence felt like it was listening. Dawn came to Keth Vorin, not like dawn comes to Earth with soft light and gentle color, but like a wound being opened in the sky, a sudden brutal slash of red and gold that split the darkness apart and flooded the arena with light that made everything look like it was on fire. Sarah stood at the gate and watched the arena floor transform. Machines beneath the surface groaned and shifted, and the flat stone ground broke apart and rearranged itself. And within minutes, the entire arena floor had become a forest, a dense tangle of alien trees with bark the color of rust, and leaves that were almost black, and a floor of soft moss that looked like velvet from where Sarah stood. It was beautiful, and it was a cage dressed up to look like freedom. The stands were full. Sarah had never seen so many beings gathered in one place, and she knew that for every creature sitting in those seats, there were billions more watching from screens on worlds she would never visit. Felt the weight of all those eyes pressing down on her, like gravity, that came from every direction at once. Arbiter Gelthari appeared beside her, and the insectoid's compound eyes caught the red dawn light and scattered it into fragments. "The third trial," Gelthari said, and their voice carried across the arena through unseen speakers so that every being present could hear, "is the trial of Dominion." The word hung in the air like smoke. Since the founding of the Concord 11,000 years ago, every petitioning species has been required to demonstrate mastery over the natural world as proof of their right to stand among the stars. Gelthari continued. "The champion will be presented with a creature, and the champion will kill it using the provided blade or their bare hands, and in doing so, it will prove that their species has risen above the animal kingdom and claimed dominion over nature itself." A blade was brought to Sarah on a cushion of dark cloth, and it was a simple thing, a curved knife with a handle wrapped in leather, and a blade that gleamed with an edge so sharp it seemed to cut the light itself. Sarah took it, and it felt heavy in a way that had nothing to do with its weight. "Release the creature," Gelthari commanded. A gate opened on the far side of the arena, and for a moment nothing happened, and the silence was so complete that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat echoing off the distant walls. Then something stumbled out of the gate and into the forest. It was small. That was the first thing Sarah noticed, and the thing that hit her like a fist in the chest, because she had been expecting a monster, some massive predator with claws and teeth and fury, something that would at least make the killing feel like a fight. But this was not a monster. The creature was about the size of a large dog on Earth, and it moved on 6 legs that were too long for its body, as if it had not yet grown into them, and its fur was the color of sapphires, a deep, impossible blue that caught the light and shimmered with every clumsy step. It was a Vorath cub. Sarah knew this because the briefing files she had studied on the journey to Kefvorin had included information about the Vorath, a non-sapient apex predator species that the Concord had classified as vermin centuries ago and marked for population control across dozens of worlds. But the files had not prepared her for how young this one was. Its muzzle was bound with a metal restraint that pressed cruelly into its fur, and one of its hind legs dragged behind it at a wrong angle, damaged during the sedation process that had been used to transport it, and Sarah could see the bruising beneath the blue fur where the drugs had been injected too roughly. The cub stumbled into the forest, and it tried to run, but its injured leg buckled, and it fell, and it made a sound that Sarah felt in her bones. A high, thin whimper that was not the sound of a predator, but the sound of a baby calling for a mother who was not coming. The cub dragged itself behind a fallen log and pressed its body against the bark and tried to make itself small and invisible, and Sarah could see its sides heaving with rapid, terrified breaths, and its one working eye, wide and wet and blue as a summer sky on Earth, peered out from behind the log and looked at nothing and everything with the pure, uncomprehending fear of a creature that did not understand why the world had suddenly become so cruel. The stands were silent. 12 trillion beings across 4,000 worlds watched and waited for the human to do what every champion before her had done. Sarah gripped the knife, and she started walking. The moss was soft under her boots, and the alien trees whispered above her in a wind she could not feel. And with every step, the cub grew larger in her vision, and the knife grew heavier in her hand. She remembered Thessar 4, and the mud, and the blood, and the sound of weapons fire that never seemed to stop. And she remembered the field hospital that was just a tent with holes in it. And she remembered the Dreft soldier they brought in on the 3rd day. He was young, so young that his scales had not yet hardened into the dark iron color of an adult Dreft. And they were still soft and pale and almost translucent, and Sarah could see the blood moving beneath them like rivers under ice. He was a child conscript, taken from his family and given a weapon and told to fight. And he had been shot through the chest, and there was nothing Sarah or anyone could do. And she held him while he died, and he looked up at her with eyes that did not understand why the world had suddenly become so cruel. The same eyes, the same terrified, confused, why is this happening eyes, that the Vorath cub was looking at her with, right now, from behind a fallen log on an alien world. 1,000 light years from that muddy battlefield. Sarah stopped walking. She was 10 feet from the cub, and the knife was in her hand, and the galaxy was watching, and the cub looked up at her with one working eye, and it whimpered, and it pressed itself harder against the log, as if it could push itself through the wood and into some safer place that did not exist. Sarah looked at the knife. She looked at the cub. She thought about Earth, and about the 8 billion people counting on her, and about the 200 years of silence that would follow if she failed. And she knelt. She knelt in the moss, in front of a frightened blue creature that did not know what it had done to deserve this. And the knife was still in her hand, and the cub was still shaking. And across the galaxy, 12 trillion beings leaned forward in their seats and held their breath. The cub looked up at her with that one working eye, wet and blue and filled with something that needed no translation in any language, and Sarah looked back, and she made her choice. She opened her hand, and the knife fell. It hit the moss-covered stone, with a sound that was small and quiet and ordinary, and yet somehow it echoed across the arena, as if the world itself had decided that this sound mattered more than any other sound that had ever been made in this place. The blade lay in the moss between Sarah and the cub, and it caught the red light of the alien dawn and glittered like a question that had just been answered. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. 12 trillion beings on 4,000 worlds sat frozen in a silence so complete that it felt like the universe had paused to watch what happened next. Sarah reached forward with both hands, moving slowly the way she had learned to move around wounded soldiers who were scared and in pain. She touched the metal muzzle that bound the cub's mouth. She found the clasp, she opened it, and she pulled the restraint away, dropping it in the moss next to the knife. Flinched when the metal came free, and its lips pulled back to show small teeth that were sharp but not yet fully grown. And it made a low sound in its throat that was half growl and half cry, and Sarah did not move. She held her hand out, palm up, fingers relaxed, and she waited. The cub's one working eye studied her hand, and its nostrils flared as it took in her scent. And Sarah could see the war happening inside the creature, the instinct to bite and the instinct to run, and something else, something softer, that was winning against both. The cub leaned forward, and its wet nose touched Sarah's palm, and it sniffed once, and then twice, and then slowly, trembling like a leaf in a storm, it pressed the side of its head against her hand, and let out a breath that sounded like it had been holding it since the moment it was taken from whatever home it had known. Sarah closed her eyes, and she felt the warmth of the cub's fur against her fingers, and she felt its heartbeat, rapid and frightened and alive, and she held her hand steady and gentle, and she let the creature decide what she was. The arena exploded, not with sound at first, but with silence breaking, a great crack in the quiet as thousands of beings surged to their feet, and the noise that followed was like nothing Sarah had ever heard, a roar that contained within it every possible reaction, outrage and wonder and confusion and fury, and something that might have been joy. On screens across the galaxy, the image burned itself into the collective memory of every species that had eyes to see it. The small human woman, kneeling in the moss, with a blade abandoned at her side, and a blue cub pressing its head into her open hand, while red alien light poured down around them both, like something holy. Arbiter Gelthari descended from the observation platform on a gravity disk, and their 4 legs clicked against the arena floor as they approached, and their compound eyes reflected the scene in a single line. 100 tiny fragments, and their voice when they spoke was as flat and clinical as it had been from the very beginning. "The champion has refused the trial of dominion," Gelthari announced, and their voice carried across the arena and across the galaxy. "By the laws of the Concord established 11,000 years ago, this constitutes a failure of the 3rd trial, and humanity's petition for membership is denied for a period of 1 full galactic cycle." The words landed like stones dropped into still water, and the ripples spread outward in every direction. Sarah looked up at the Arbiter, and the cub pressed closer against her legs, and she felt its small body shaking, and she put her hand on its back to steady it. "I understand," Sarah said. "You will be returned to your world," Gelthari said. "The creature will be returned to the Concord's wildlife management program." "What does that mean for the cub?" Sarah asked, and her voice was steady, but there was an "and" there, edge in it now, a hardness that had not been there before. Gelthari paused for exactly 1 second, which for a being of their precision was the equivalent of a very long hesitation. It will be processed according to standard protocols for Vorath specimens. You mean, killed? The Arbiter said nothing, and that was answer enough. Sarah stood, and the cub stood with her, pressing against her legs, and she turned to face the broadcast array, the cluster of floating cameras and transmission nodes that were sending her image to every corner of the civilized galaxy. She had not planned to speak. She had not prepared words, or rehearsed a statement, or thought about what she would say to 12 trillion strangers who were watching her throw away her species' future, because she could not bring herself to kill a frightened baby animal. But the words came anyway, and they came from the same place inside her that had held the dying Dreth boy on Thessar 4. That had chosen to become a medic instead of a soldier, and that had looked into the cub's eye and seen something that mattered more than politics or tradition or fear. You asked me to prove humanity's worth, she said, and her voice did not shake, and it carried clean and clear through the broadcast array, to every screen, on every world. This is it. She paused, and in that pause, the galaxy leaned closer. We do not prove our strength by destroying what is weaker than us, she said. We prove it by choosing not to. The broadcast feed was supposed to cut after the Arbiter's formal declaration, and the technical operators on Keth-Voran moved to shut down the transmission. But something happened that had never happened before in the history of the Concord's broadcast network. The feeds stayed live, not because of a malfunction, but because across dozens of worlds, billions of viewers simultaneously jammed the relay networks with override requests of beings who refused to let the image disappear, who grabbed onto the signal with every tool they had and held it open through sheer collective will. The engineers tried 3 times to cut the feed, and 3 times the network refused, because the network was not a single machine, but a distributed system that responded to demand, and the demand was overwhelming and absolute. The galaxy wanted to keep watching. Sarah did not know any of this, as guards approached and gently but firmly took the cub from her legs, and the cub cried out, a sharp blue sound of distress that cut through the noise of the arena like a blade through silk, and Sarah watched them carry it away, and she said nothing because there was nothing left to say. They took her to a holding cell beneath the arena, and the door closed, and the sounds of the crowd above were muffled, but not gone. A distant rumble that vibrated through the walls like the heartbeat of something enormous. Sarah sat on the metal bench, and she put her face in her hands, and she breathed, and she did not cry because she had learned a long time ago that crying could wait, but breathing could not. She had failed. Earth would wait another 200 years, and it was her fault, and she had known exactly what she was doing when she dropped that knife, and she would make the same choice again every single time. And that knowledge was both a comfort and a wound. Hours passed, or what felt like hours, and the rumble above did not stop, and if anything, it grew louder and more rhythmic. And Sarah lifted her head and listened, and there was a pattern to it now, a rising and falling cadence that sounded almost like a word being repeated over and over by thousands of voices. The door opened, and a guard stepped in. A tall reptilian being with scales the color of copper, and an expression on their face that Sarah had never seen on an alien before. A mixture of confusion and something that looked almost like. "What is that sound?" Sarah asked. The guards stared at her for a long moment, and when they spoke, their voice was quiet and bewildered. "The crowd is still here," the guard said. "They will not leave." "What are they saying?" The guard paused, and their copper scales shifted color slightly in a way that Sarah had learned meant deep emotion in their species. "They are chanting your name," the guard said. "They are chanting the human's name, and they will not stop." Sarah sat very still on the metal bench in the holding cell, beneath the arena, on a world 1,000 light-years from home. She listened to the sound of her name being spoken by thousands of alien voices who had never met a human before today, and who could not even pronounce the word properly, but who were trying anyway. And above the arena, The screen still glowed with the image of a woman kneeling before a blue cub with a knife abandoned in the moss, and the galaxy watched and could not look away. The galaxy did not sleep that night. On Yeldari Prime, a world of gentle oceans and floating cities, where a species of empaths had lived for 10,000 years before the Concord came and told them they were too soft for the stars. The streets filled with people who had never marched for anything in their lives. The Yeldari were small beings with luminous skin that changed color with their emotions, and on this night, every single one of them glowed the same shade of deep radiant blue, the color of compassion in their culture, the color they had been taught to suppress because the Concord called it weakness. They carried images of Sarah projected from handheld devices, and the images floated above the crowds like lanterns. And the Yeldari had a word for what Sarah had done, a word from their oldest language that had been forbidden for centuries because the Concord considered it dangerous. Amathel. It meant the one who kneels so others may stand. Chanted it through the streets of their floating cities, and the sound carried across the water and into the sky. And for the first time in living memory, the Yeldari were not ashamed of what they were. On Drenhari, things were different, because the Drenhari were warriors, massive four-armed beings who had built their entire civilization on the principle that strength was the only virtue that mattered, and that mercy was a disease of the spirit. But even on Drenhari, something was shifting. In the great war academies where young soldiers trained to become the deadliest fighters in the galaxy, the instructors played Sarah's clip during the evening meal, and the dining halls fell silent, and the silence was not the silence of contempt. A Drenharian general named Kafen, one of the most decorated soldiers in the history of her species, stood before a gathering of 10,000 warriors, and she said something that would have been unthinkable the day before. That killing a frightened cub proves nothing, and that any fool with a blade can destroy what is weaker than them, and that true strength, the kind of strength that wins wars and builds empires and makes a species worthy of the stars, is the strength to hold power in your hand and choose not to use it. Half the warriors in the hall roared in agreement, and the other half roared in fury, and for the first time in Drenharian history, the argument about what strength truly meant had been spoken out loud. On 100 other worlds, the same conversations were happening in 1,000 different languages, and the galaxy was arguing with itself in a way it had not argued in centuries. Because Sarah's choice had cracked open a question that the Concord had sealed shut 11,000 years ago. What does it mean to be worthy? The Concord Council was in chaos. In the Great Hall on Kethvoran, where the representatives of 4,000 species gathered to govern the galaxy, the chamber had erupted into something that veteran diplomats said they had never seen before. Not debate, but genuine crisis. A fracturing of consensus that threatened to reshape the political landscape of known space. The hardliner species, the ones who had built their power on the old ways, demanded that the rules be upheld without exception, because tradition was the foundation of the Concord. And if one human could overturn 11,000 years of precedent, then the entire system would collapse. The reform-minded species, many of whom had been quietly uncomfortable with the trials for centuries, but had never found the courage or the catalyst to speak up, argued that the trial of dominion was barbaric, and that Sarah had not failed, but had exposed a rot at the core of the Concord's values. The arguments went back and forth, and the volume rose and fell, and on the screens above the chamber, the image of Sarah kneeling before the cub played on an endless loop. Set it as the background display, and nobody could agree on whether to take it down. In the midst of this storm, Arbiter Jelthari walked through the corridors beneath the arena to the holding cell where Sarah waited. The guards let Jelthari in without question, and the door closed behind them, and for a long moment the Arbiter and the human simply looked at each other in silence. Jelthari was different now, in a way that Sarah could not immediately identify. And then she realized what it was. The Arbiter's compound eyes, which had always been perfectly still and perfectly controlled, were trembling. Tiny vibrations that in an insectoid species meant something profound. Jelthari was afraid. "I need to tell you something," the Arbiter said, and their voice was not flat anymore. It was cracked and raw, and it sounded like a voice that had been holding itself together for a very long time, and had finally decided to stop. "When my species petitioned for membership in the Concord, I was our champion," Jelthari said. "I was young and I believed in the system, and when they brought out the creature for my trial of dominion, it was a Melith, a small burrowing animal from my homeworld, with soft fur and large eyes." Jelthari paused, and the trembling in their eyes grew worse. "I knew that creature," they said. "Not that specific one, but its kind. They lived in the gardens of my family's home. And when I was a larva, I would watch them dig, and I would feed them, and they were gentle things that harmed nothing." "And they made you kill it," Sarah said softly. "I killed it quickly," Jelthari said. "I told myself it was necessary, and I told myself it was just an animal, and I told myself that the membership was worth more than one small life. And I have told myself these things every day for 47 years, and I have never once believed them." The Arbiter's forelegs shifted, and their claws scraped against the floor. Voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "When you dropped that knife, I felt something I have not felt in 47 years. "What?" Sarah asked. "Relief," Jelthari said. "Relief that someone finally refused." They looked at each other across the small cell, and between them was an understanding that did not need words. The understanding of two beings who knew what it cost to carry the weight of a choice you could never take back, and the different kind of weight that came from making the choice you wished you had made the first time. "There is a motion before the council," Jelthari said, and their voice was steady again, but it was a different kind of steady now. Not the steadiness of control, but the steadiness of purpose. "A coalition of 1,200 member species has filed a formal demand to admit humanity immediately, and to abolish the Dominion kill permanently." Sarah stared at the Arbiter and she could not speak. "It will go to a full vote tomorrow," Jelthari said. "Every species will cast their decision, and the galaxy will be watching." "Will it pass?" Sarah whispered. Jelthari's compound eyes caught the light, and for the first time since Sarah had met them, something shifted in those fractured reflections, something that might have been hope. "I do not know," the Arbiter said, "but I know this. For 11,000 years, champions have walked into that arena and done what they were told, and the galaxy never questioned it. Not once, not until a small human woman with a medic's hands dropped a knife in the moss and said no." Jelthari moved toward the door, and then stopped and turned back. "They want you to address the full council before the vote," they said. "Every seat will be filled, and every world will be watching." "What am I supposed to say?" The Arbiter looked at her, and their trembling eyes were still. "You will know," Jelthari said. "You have always known." Door opened, and Jelthari left, and Sarah sat alone in the cell. And she heard the crowd still chanting above her. And she thought about a dying boy on Thessar 4, and a blue cub behind a fallen log, and a knife lying in the moss. And she thought about tomorrow. And for the first time since she had arrived on this world, she was not afraid. The grand chamber of the Galactic Concord was not built to human scale, and standing at its center, Sarah felt like a single word written on an empty page that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The chamber was carved into the living rock of Kefvorin's largest mountain, and it rose above her in tiers that seemed to go on forever. Each level filled with representatives from species she had never seen and could barely comprehend. Beings of light and stone and water and metal and flesh in every configuration the universe had ever imagined. 4,000 species. Every seat was filled. And above the chamber, floating in the air like captured stars, the broadcast nodes hummed and glowed, and carried this moment to every inhabited world in the galaxy, where trillions upon trillions of beings watched and waited for what came next. Sarah stood at the center of it all, in the same clothes she had worn in the arena, still stained with moss and dirt, and in her arms she held the Vorath cub. Zelthari had brought the cub to her that morning without explanation, simply appearing at her cell door with the small blue creature cradled carefully in their segmented arms. And when Sarah took the cub, it pressed its head against her chest and made a sound like a purr mixed with a sigh. And Zelthari had watched this with trembling eyes and said nothing. The cub was calm now, its injured leg wrapped in a proper bandage that Sarah had applied herself, using techniques she had learned in field medicine, and it rested against her with the total trust of a creature that had decided this human was safe and would not be convinced otherwise. The Speaker of the Council, an ancient being whose species Sarah did not recognize, called the chamber to order, and the sound that followed was not silence, but the absence of everything except attention. 4,000 species focusing their collective awareness on a single point began. The hardliners spoke first, and their arguments were old and polished by centuries of repetition. Tradition was sacred. The trials existed for a reason. Exceptions would destroy the system. Weakness could not be rewarded. A representative from the Keth Dominion, a species of crystalline beings whose bodies rang like bells when they spoke, declared that the human had failed, and that failure had meaning, and to ignore that meaning was to tell every species that had passed the trial that their sacrifice was worthless. A representative from the Gorath Empire, the same species whose massive champion had crushed the first trial with brute force, stood and spoke in a voice like grinding boulders, and said that dominion was the natural order, and that any species too soft to kill when required was too soft to survive among the stars. The reformists answered, and their arguments were newer and rougher, and carried the energy of things that had been kept silent for too long. The Yeldari representatives stood, and their luminous skin blazed blue, and they spoke about how their species had been forced to kill during their own proving, and how it had changed something in them, had taught them that the galaxy valued violence above all else, and how they had spent centuries trying to become something they were not, because the Concord told them their natural compassion was a flaw. The Drenharian General Koth then appeared by holographic projection, and her forearms were crossed, and her voice was hard, and she said that she had killed more enemies than she could count, and that she knew exactly what strength looked like, and that the human woman standing in that chamber with a bandaged cub in her arms was the strongest warrior she had ever seen. The debate raged, and the hours passed, and Sarah listened to it all, and the cub slept against her chest, and she could feel its heartbeat against her own. Two rhythms from two different worlds beating in something close to harmony. Then the speaker called her name. The council recognizes the human champion Sarah Marin, the ancient being said. You may address the assembly. Sarah looked up at the tiers of alien faces stretching into the darkness above her, and she felt the weight of every eye in the galaxy pressing down on her, and the cub stirred against her chest, and she put her hand on its back and felt it settle. She had thought about what to say all night, and she had written speeches in her head and discarded them one by one because none of them were right. None of them were true enough for this moment. So she told the truth. 3 years ago I was a medic on a world called Thessar 4, she said, and her voice was quiet, but the chamber's acoustics carried it to every seat and every screen. There was a war, and I was there to save lives, and on the third day they brought me a soldier from the other side, a Dreth boy whose scales had not even hardened yet. Because he was that young, the chamber was still. He had been shot through the chest and there was nothing I could do, and I held him while he died, and he was scared, and he did not understand why this was happening to him, and he looked at me with eyes that asked a question I could not answer. She paused, and the cub shifted in her arms, and she looked down at it, and its blue eye looked back up at her, When I walked into that arena, and I saw this cub, muzzled and limping and hiding behind a log, I saw those same eyes, asking that same question, and I want you to understand something. I did not drop that knife because I am weak, and I did not drop it because I do not understand what was at stake. She looked up at the chamber, and her voice grew stronger, not louder, but deeper and more certain. I dropped it because I have held a dying child in my arms, and I know exactly what it costs to take a life that did not need to be taken, and I will not pay that price. Again, not for membership, not for tradition, not for anything. You wanted to know what humanity is, she said. This is what we are. We are the species that walks into the darkness with medicine before weapons. We are the species that holds the dying, and grieves for the enemy, and names the things we rescue. We are not perfect, and we are not always kind, but we believe in something that I think you used to believe in too, before 11,000 years of tradition taught you to forget. She held the cub closer, and it pressed its head against her neck, and she spoke the last words not to the council, but to every being watching across every world. Mercy is not the absence of strength, she said. It is strength's highest form, and any civilization that has forgotten that has lost something more important than any trial can measure. She stopped speaking, and the chamber was silent, and the silence lasted for exactly 11 seconds, which on a galactic scale was an eternity. The speaker called the vote. The numbers appeared on the screens above the chamber, as each species cast their decision, and Sarah watched them climb, and she held the cub, and she breathed. 3,214 species voted to admit humanity. 788 voted against. 12 abstained. The chamber erupted, and the sound was not a roar, but a wave, a great sweeping tide of voices in thousands of languages, all saying different things that all meant the same thing. Humanity was in. And in the same vote, by a margin even larger than the first, the council formally abolished the trial of dominion forever, struck it from the records, and declared that no petitioning species would ever again be asked to kill to prove their worth. In its place, they established a new final trial, and they called it the Marin Choice, and the rules were simple. The champion would be presented with an opportunity for easy violence, and they would be judged not on their willingness to act, but on their ability to find another way. Sarah objected to the name, and was overruled by a margin of 3,912 to 1, the one being Sarah herself. She went home. The journey back to Earth took 11 days, and she spent most of it sitting in the observation deck of the Concorde transport ship with Kel sleeping at her feet. She had named the cub Kel, because on Thessar 4, in the last moments of his life, the dying Dreth boy had whispered a word in his own language, and she had asked the translators later what it meant, and they told her it meant second chance. Kel had grown since the arena. His legs were longer, and his fur was thicker, and his injured hind leg had healed well under Sarah's care, and he walked with only the slightest limp, and when he slept, he made a sound like distant thunder mixed with a cat's purr. Earth welcomed her like a returning star, while everything was noise and ceremony and faces she did not recognize, calling her a hero, and Sarah endured it with the same steady patience she had used to endure everything else. And when it was over, she went to a farmhouse in a valley that she had bought with the last of her military pension, and she sat on the porch and watched the sun set over green hills that looked nothing like the red deserts of Kethvorin. Kel lay at her feet, twice the size he had been in the arena, his sapphire fur catching the golden light of a star he had never seen before and would never leave. Months passed, and life became quiet, which was all Sarah had ever really wanted. Then one evening, a message arrived on her console, and it was from Jelthari, and Sarah smiled when she saw the Arbiter's identifier, because they had been writing to each other regularly, and their conversations had become something that Sarah treasured, the quiet correspondence of two people who understood each other in a way that did not require explanation. The message said that the first class of new petitioning species were approaching their Marin choice, and that one of them, a young champion from a tiny world at the edge of known space, had heard Sarah's story and had asked if there was any advice the human could offer. Sarah sat on her porch with the evening air cooling around her, and Kel warm against her legs, and the stars coming out one by one above the valley. And she opened the reply channel, and she spoke. When the moment comes, you will want to be strong, and that is fine. Just remember that real strength has never been about what you can destroy. She closed the channel, and she put her hand on Kel's back, and felt the steady rhythm of his breathing, and she looked up at the stars that were no longer distant and unknowable, but connected, a vast web of worlds that were watching and listening and learning, and across the galaxy in 10,000 languages, on worlds that had never heard of Earth, they told the story of the human who knelt. And in the telling, the universe became a little more gentle.